everyone, Ty392 here, back for another video. Now, since that 1HD FTE engine overview went quite well in Australia and in some parts of Japan, konnichiwa my friends. Well, I decided to cover the car that it's based around. This is, of course, the J100 Land Cruiser. It's often criticized for being the Land Cruiser that went softy, compared to, let's say, its predecessor, the J80 Land Cruiser, or the Ninja Turtle as we call it here locally. Now the J100 rather unfairly gets treated quite badly by the 4Drive press, especially if you look at period reviews of the 1999 back in Australia. They praised this engine, but they rather crucified it in a rather cruel fashion by saying that we will never forgive Toyota for not putting this engine in the Land Cruiser 105, which we will come to in a bit. Now, this particular Land Cruiser that's been with us for about 10 years, I think we bought it back in 2009 or 2010, is finished in blue vapor metallic. And also it's a 1998 build, so for a Land Cruiser file to hear this color combination and this model year doesn't really ring a bell, right? Well, I'll tell you, this car is a resprayed vehicle. It was originally gray, and it was, before we purchased it, finished in a blue vapor metallic paint by its previous owner. This color, of course, comes on the 2003 Lexus LX470, as well as the Toyota Land Cruiser Cygnus, or Sinus, in some parts of Asia. Now, this new series is going to be called Pedantophiles. It's like a mixture of the word pedantic and country files, mixed together to become this whole hodgepodge of weird nerdery geek out that nobody on the internet probably is going to see this. I doubt this thing will break 1,000 views. This series is going to cover both the development of the J100 Land Cruiser, as well as the small, minute changes they made between 1998 all the way to 2007. From Koki spec to Zenki spec, or Zenki spec to Koki spec. The J100 Land Cruiser was initially developed / prototyped back in 1994 circa by this gentleman. Now the chief engineer of the J100 Land Cruiser is Mr. Takio Kondo. Now Mr. Takio Kondo has started with Toyota in 1967, initially designing suspension parts for, let's say, the Starlet, the Mark II, the Corona, Toyota Corsa, as well as the Tercel. Now he became project manager for the Toyota Land Cruiser series back in 1980, and chief Land Cruiser engineer in 1990, which means he had a hand designing the legendary J80 series. Understanding the engineer's background, you can see why the renewed shift of the 100 series over the 80 series. Now, the 100 series design, the chassis-wise, is still a body-on-frame-like construction, but unlike the previous 80 series Land Cruiser, the focus was shifted more towards comfort and refinement, just like as he was quoted back in 1998. Now, the changes to the 100 series chassis-wise is quite obvious. The width of the vehicle from behind is a lot wider, but the wheelbase remained the same. Now, the wheelbase is exactly the same as you would find on the 200 series, its subsequent successor. Now, chassis-wise, the J80, J100, and J200s have the exact same wheelbase. Hard to think that, right? If you park a, let's say, 100 series and 80 series side by side, you would swear the 100 series is bigger. That's probably due to the shape of the body and the rear track. That's, I think, the sort of visual changes you'll see physically. And if you park the 100 next to a 200, well, that change is even bigger because the J200 is also a bit wider as well as a bit taller up top as well. Now, understandably, if you're a cruiser nerd or a cruiser file, you're probably screaming at the television right now. They're asking, where's the 105? Well, we'll discuss it right now. Now, for those who are not in the know, the 105 is basically the solid axle version, front and rear version of the J100. Now, it's popular for several reasons, primarily the front axle. It retains its 80 series-esque solid front axle setup with coils. Now, this is a very, let's just say, popular option for people who want to modify their vehicles to go touring, or even for, heck, even competition trucks. I think use some 105 parts, bar Nissan Patrol parts, of course. Anyway, the 105 is said to be better in off-roading conditions simply because of more wheel articulation, as well as less parts breakage, more reliability. Now, the 105 has a, well, let's just say, an urban myth going around that it's basically a 100 series body on top of an 80 series chassis. Now, that can't be further than the truth. Now, I've been researching this for a while. I've been digging through some I Hate Mud sort of forums online, as well as some sort of speculative papers, and all that. And I discovered this piece of info. Now, this is a 80 series chassis and a 105's chassis diagram side by side. Now, visually they look about the same. Heck, the wheelbase is about the same for most of them actually. But if you take a look closer, the front axle is about the same until you follow through to the back. Now, this is where the changes mostly happen. The rear axle is also completely different as well. The 105 has a wider body, so to accommodate that, the 105's chassis, not to mention its driveline, is a little bit different. It's actually widened at the post, I think in the third or fourth rung, according to this picture. Now, after that, you will see that some points have been moved to sort of widen the car, as well as elongate the chassis in the sort of second row compartment to accommodate the 100 series body on top. Now, if you pay attention closely to here, it's actually lengthened slightly. So it does provide a little bit more stability, especially if you jack it up and put your 35-inch tires and 4-inch lifts and all that. It's actually a lot safer than the 80 series. Doesn't stop people from rolling them actually. Now, mechanically, the 100 series came with two choices if you're talking about the IFS vehicles, and two choices for the naturally aspirated twins of the solid axle vehicles. Now, the J100 only came in 1HD FTE 4.2 Turbo 6 form or 2UZ FE naturally aspirated V8 form. Those were standard across the board, unless you live in Australia, which had the 1HZT or 1HZ naturally aspirated for the IFS 100. Now, in terms of gearboxes, you will see, of course, the automatic version as well as the manual. This car featured here has the 4-speed auto. The manual came in mostly in Australia, but you do see some sort of Japanese domestic market ones as well, but they're probably in like VX trim or some GXL spec. Now, GXL coincidentally is Australian spec, so most of it is in Australia, unfortunately. Now, most of the 4-speeds were paired to both the V8 and the inline 6 1HD FTE. They then changed to a 5-speed automatic, I think in 2003, when they introduced the first refresh of the J100. Coupled that with the next refresh of the Sinus, as well as the LX470 of the time. Most of them used 5-speed autos, though you could still get a 4-speed auto back in 2001 or in 2002, which is kind of old-fashioned. Now, the manual is a 5-speed, and is very similar to that of the HDJ79 series, as you would see in Australia, the Ute. Now, the difference between a 105 and the 100 series is gearboxes. They're totally exactly the same. The only difference is in the transfer case. Now the J100s, of course, understandably, has a transfer case. Now, the transfer cases for these vehicles are almost identical across the board, except for the 105s. There are two distinct flavors of 105 transfer cases. the similar to the IFS vehicle 100 series constant four-wheel drive transfer case, and the more traditional part-time transfer case you would find in, let's say, a 60 series. Now, most IFS 100s come with a constant four-wheel drive transfer case, so the front hubs cannot be engaged or disengaged from factory. Now, internally they have this sort of spider wheel in the transfer case that acts as an open diff, which can be locked from a switch in the cabin, like this picture here. Now, the GX models are different to that as well. Now, the GXs have this part-time transfer case system that allows you to disengage the vehicle from four-wheel drive into two-wheel drive, which means that it becomes a rear-wheel drive vehicle for most of the times until you need four-wheel drive, in which case you get out of the vehicle, you lock the front hubs on the front of the vehicles, two of them, then you engage 4 high and subsequently 4 low if you need to get out of a really sticky situation. Now, the later model cars, the sort of cokey vehicles, had the 5-speed automatics, which is the pick of the bunch. It had the right amount of gears, it had the perfect sort of rear axle ratio, which means it brought the revs down significantly. If you've seen this little acceleration video, you can see that whenever I'm pinned to about 100 kilometers an hour, I think it's about 2,100, 2,200 RPM, which is fine until you listen to it for a long time. It's gonna drone you eventually. Now, there is, of course, another change. If you look at the rear axle of a 105, depending on which model you get, it's actually beefier with a full floating rear axle or a semi-full floating, depending on which 105 you go for. It's not as cut and dry that they use the same chassis. Now, the styling of the 100 series is not particularly special. It doesn't have any sort of standout features like, you know, the Alpine windows of a Land Rover Defender or this cut 3/4 length window of a Range Rover. It doesn't have that. What it does have is subtle, understated design. No one will give a hoot of who you are, and they can't tell you of your status wealth. It's kind of like the Land Rover Defender. It's kind of a classless vehicle. Don't believe me? If you go look at your local farmer or someone, you will notice that they drive around in old 40 series Land Cruisers, or hell, even 60 series Land Cruisers. Now, the 100 series styling is quite subdued. It doesn't have any sort of standout features. The only standout feature I can really sort of point out to is the little vent in the back of the D-pillar. That little sort of device is actually a little vent on the rear of the wagon. It is a pressure equalizing flap that relieves pressure every single time you close the door, which means whenever you open it, it opens with a satisfying thunk and closes with a thud every single time without you having to do it and slam it harder again. To follow the lines of the car, you can see this is a haunch line that starts from the bottom of the front bumper, the center of the front bumper, which tapers all the way to the rear of the vehicle, following the tail lights as well. Now, this makes it sort of like a house shape, that it tapers from the bottom to a wider stance, then eventually tapers to the top.
It is the splitter.
Yeah, that's on fire.
Drive
Hey,
wait a minute.
Quickly.
This is something I've wanted to do. I've worked in television for 20 years, never had the chance yet, okay?
Back to the studio.
Hey, that's my line! That's what I wanted to say! Mate, you
When you come to the inside of this vehicle, you would see this sort of two-tone sort of color combination on this car, which is sort of like a brown mixed in with like a sort of khaki or cream interior, which is my personal favorite for any sort of luxury car. Black leather interiors, in my opinion, are sort of too gothic. It makes it feel smaller in comparison. Now, moving on from that, you would see here the transfer case lever, as well as the automatic shifter, as well as these nifty heated and cooled seats. Heated mostly, because this car originally came from the northern parts of Japan, where this car had the optional sunglass holder, as well as not having a sub-fuel tank. The sub-fuel tanks were sort of more common in Australia, especially the JXLs. And this doesn't have this rear locker, which was factory fitted in the rear. Ergonomically, this car is basically perfect. If I drive like this, I could reach all my controls. I could get to the nav screen without really taking my eyes off the road, and adjust these AC controls without much hassle, even though it feels a bit, let's just say, not up to what it would have cost back in 1998, especially with this plastic. Now, the J100 platform was launched in January 1998. There is 3 distinct trim levels for the J100. Well, actually, there's a sub-model of a sub-model as well. Now, we'll start with the sub-models. The first one being the van variants as well as the wagon variants. The wagon variants happen to have the third row seating included. The vans happen to be 5-seaters as standard. Now, you then come to the sort of spec hunters vibe for Toyotas. I told you this is pedantophiles for a reason. Now, they start with, of course, the VX, which happens to be at the very bottom of that list. Now, this nets you cloth seats, no wood trimming, as well as standard features along with some steel wheels on the car. Now, when you pay extra money for a VX Limited, you get better wheels as well as optional diff locks, rear lockers specifically. Now, the G Selection happens to be top dog. Now, the top dog car gets all the wood trim you could ever need. Probably enough to swallow the entire Amazon rainforest if you want to. You then have the optional leather seats as well, which is kind of confusing because going on the tangent here, the VX Limited also had leather seats as an option. The G Selection had them as an option as well, because I've seen some YouTube videos, I think on FlexNet somewhere, that they have cloth seats even in G Selection trim. Kind of confusing, right? Oh, you thought we were done with variants, aren't ya? Well, aside from the regular J100's van, wagon, G Selection gibberish, you then have the Sinus, or Cygnus, and the LX470. Told you this was annoying. Now, the LX470 and the Sinus was basically a sort of top spec version of the J100 with all the bits added in with more on top. It's kind of like the autobiography package on a Range Rover, or maybe a Defender putting the XS badging on it. Let's actually go over what makes a Sinus and an LX470 different from, let's say, the normal J100 Land Cruiser. Now, the primary change from the outside of the vehicle happens to be of course, the grille, as well as the bonnet. Now, the bonnet of the J100 is different to that of the Sinus LX470 versions. It has this sort of clamshell that happens to integrate the grille as well as the bonnet in one piece that lifts the whole way up. Now, the headlights of these vehicles happen to be a split headlight as well. These look very similar to that of the JZS 161 GS300s of the equivalent time. Now, these also had these sort of special two-tone split colors. Yes, they did the two-tone again, but they did it in this more classy version, especially in the Koki spec of the Sinus. This, for example, you have a black top as well as this sort of gray, gunmetal grayish bottom pair. It looks very classy actually. If you look at it from afar, it doesn't really say much until it comes up. It looks very stately. Now, from the inside as well, the Sinus and the LX470 differentiate with a different center cluster. Now, when I say different, the only thing that's actually physically different is that the bottom section of that center cluster happens to be extended slightly. Apparently it's for a tape deck or something. Apparently they still thought tape decks or a GPS nav were a good thing. Now, the top section of that is also very different as well. The vents as well as the center sort of navigation screen aren't completely plastered in wood trim. Instead, only the bottom section is plastered in wood trim. When you get to the center of where the gear selector and the transfer case lever are, it has this sort of chrome-ish, looks like the top of someone's Rolex look to the center as well. Now, any other visual changes? Of course, there's this sort of wood trimming you get on the top of the door handles as well. Of course, another notable change is the door handle inside. Now, the door handles are in chrome as well, not body colored plastic like you get in the J100. And allegedly, I think the primary sort of cost difference between the two is the additional sound deadening inside the vehicle. I can't sort of disprove it or make fact of it. It just seems to be a lot quieter inside compared to, say, an equivalent J100 from 2005-ish. Now, the Cygnus was also, of course, featured with a different sound system. This had a Mark Levinson system fitted from factory. So that should probably explain the sort of differences in price for the time. The Cygnus, of course, was priced way higher than the regular J100. Now, if you turn your attention back to that weird sort of extendo thing I mentioned earlier in the sinus part, this apparently is an automatic sound levelizer. Don't know what that means, it just happens to be some Japanese malarkey. But it does sound pretty cool, I will have to admit that. Now, another change for the Cygnus over, let's say, the regular J100 is, of course, in terms of the interior, is, of course, the sun visors. I can't believe even the sun visors are even different for this car. The sunroof as well, apparently. The sun visors, of course, has two pieces. This car, the earlier car, has this sort of single piece that unfolds to the front, whereas the later model cars had this sort of split version. And it's definitely a lot better, especially if you live in like warmer climates here, like in Borneo. They, of course, have many different options available, let's say, but we'll move that on to the next segment. Now, the Cygnus was, of course, featured with this sort of night view vision thing. Now, this little device is fitted on top of the instrument cluster on the driver's side, as well as an accompanying sort of digital eye that's fitted at the top of where the rear view mirror is. Now, the controls for that are at the bottom. Now, to tell if the car you're about to buy or / own has this sort of night vision thing, first, visually on the outside, look for these two smaller dimple lights. Now, these dimple lights are part of the package that includes the night view system. The night view system is controlled through this front, the driver's side left bottom sort of controls, where you can turn it on and off. Now, the difference between high beam on and high beam off is, of course, visibility. If you look at it this is from a brochure's point of view, the night view actually throws the light all the way to 200 meters, which is quite a big jump. If you say, referring to this graph, the low beams only throw around about 50 meters, where on high beam is about 125, 150 for high beams. Now we'll start with the 1998 spec LC100, the Zenki version as we shall call it now. Now these J100 and Zenki spec had the more traditional sort of split headlights. They look kind of ordinary without any sort of special treatment. They look rather dull. Now the grille doesn't really help with it having a chrome side and a black center, with the strakes inside of said grille being painted black as well. Now the bottom of that also features the running lights. Now of course we move on to the side of the vehicle, which is where you see the doors as well as the wheels. Now the wheels are the first thing to jump out at you, as they are the traditional 5 spokes in the chalk spec, as I like to call them. They're thick, they're pretty heavy. I think they're on 16-inch or 17-inch wheels. Only the LX470s came in 18-inch. These earlier Zenki cars came in 16 only. Oh, I forgot to mention that the side claddings for the 100 series also had this sort of two-tone-esque paint job. Toyota clearly remembered the 90s, then they just stuck this two-tone style paint job on the side of the 100 series, much like the 80 series, if you look carefully enough. It depends rather on what sort of paint you got. If you, for example, got white, you would get matching white undertones as well. If you got, say, something as colorful as Blue Vapor Metallic like this car, you would get a body matched body pan of doors as well as the side sills as well. If you got something, let's say, had contrasting colors, something like green, you would get a green sort of top layer as well as sort of a gray bottom layer. It's like a little extension for the doors. We move on, of course, to the Chuki version of this car. Now, there isn't really much change in terms of it externally being a full rehaul, but you did get some nice sort of updates, primarily in the shape of course, the center grille. Now, the center grille wasn't painted in the drab old colors of just black centers, kind of like you would put on the GX spec car. Now, the outside obviously was chrome, and this time the strakes themselves are also chrome as well. The headlights were also updated slightly, with not really a big jump as well. Now, when you go to the side of the vehicle, you would see that this sort of two-tone cladding sort of like went the way of the wayside, and Toyota decided maybe we shouldn't remember this in the 1990s again. They decided to paint every part of the body panels, including that sort of extension part, in body color as well. Now, for 2003, you also got different wheels. You got these 17-inch wheels, which they look kind of like snowflake wheels, but they don't. This is only my personal taste. I prefer the LX 470 wheels over these. Now, fundamentally for the Chuki, there wasn't really much difference outside. Inside is where the real magic happens. Now, the dashboard was a complete facelift. It's not even the same league as the old car. The center cluster was adorned by a sort of navigation unit on the special G selection models, as well as this sort of tape deck recording device at the bottom, and in between the navigation screen and that little tape recorder cassette thing, you got this little interesting center cluster that tells you the security, which is if the immobilizer is on, the outside temperature, which is useful, the temperature of the AC, which is also kind of useful unless you need to go change the settings, which involves going inside the menu, which is complete rubbish. Then you have, of course, the time, where there alongside it is a couple of preset buttons that you can press to adjust the time. Now, it's primarily a sort of very good design. It also came with this sort of multi-function steering wheel where the your left thumb controls the volume, as well as the skip track features, as well as the mode button for the infotainment system in the car, as well as this sort of new style cladding to the steering wheel, with the SRS center being a little bit different in shape. Fundamentally, they're about the same wheel. Now, something I failed to mention in the Chuki part of the video is that not all cars had this sort of special center cluster. If you went down the grade from the G selections to, let's say, the VX Limited or probably even the VX, the center cluster is a completely different look. Now, the top of said non-G selection will have the sort of multifunction display that displays the outside temperature, the inside temperature, as well as the clock on the top. At the bottom of that sits the factory stereo system, which is like an old cassette deck where you insert a cassette and a traditional FM tuner. That's it. That's what you get. Heck, if you went full caveman spec on, let's say, the VX, you don't get any of that at all. You just get this little plastic blank in the center. How lazy could Toyota be just sticking a freaking blank in the center? Actually, they've been doing this for quite a while now. Even the latest 200 series in Japan, if you go for the AX,
without any options, any box ticked, you will still get this black center cover. How cheap could that be? Now, moving of course to the most desirable spec, that is of course the Koki. Now, the Koki spec car has, like this car, has the enlarged center grille. Now, the center grille is physically bigger, it's just that the strakes on the center of the vehicle are much larger in diameter, and the chrome surround as well as the new headlights are an all new feature. The sort of fog lamps at the bottom look exactly the same as you would see in the original 100 series. Probably a little bit of different body cladding with this little smaller end plate at the bottom of the bumper, but visually it's about the same thing if you look for them stock for stock. And I doubt there are many sort of non-modified J100s without the factory optional body kit, which including this car has it as well. Now, the J100 of course has a list of a factory option. On the exterior, of course, is the body kit you will see on this particular car. It extends it with a lip in the front, the rear, as well as a side step that goes a lot more downwards. It's more for that street car-esque look, which you really do want in one of these cars if you're cruising down High Street. Now, the next sort of visual change, sort of optional extras you could have is the A-bar. Now, the A-bar is fitted on mostly Zenki spec vehicles. I haven't seen a Koki spec or a Chuki spec car with this sort of factory fitted A-bar. There probably are, but maybe they weren't so popular, so they sort of phased it out for the Koki spec. Now, of course, you can have it fitted in the center console if you option the fridge. If you don't option the fridge, the third row cargo space is also entirely different in terms of the difference between a van and the wagon. Now, if you look on a van, let's say this car, it has this sort of side netting on both sides of the car. One side is larger than the other. On the sort of wagon car, the sort of storage buckets open vertically for you to drop something tall inside of them. They don't open outwards, obviously, to accommodate the seats. Now, after seeing this video, you'll say, this is the perfect sort of grey nomad retirement vehicle for towing like a 2-ton caravan up a hill, up in Adelaide or somewhere. Not really. The 100 series, prior to getting its sort of soft roader images, was quite successful in the racing scene. The 100 series, entered by Team Arco / Team Autobody, its current name, of the Toyota TRD Dakar Rally division of Toyota's racing team, entered the 100 series starting in 1998. Now, the 100 series was there also to replace the aging 80 series platform, which started back in 1991 all the way till 1997, the last year of the 80 series chassis. The 100 series took over the reins over the 80 series and won its class back in 1998. Now, they continued racing all the way to about 2006-ish, and they comfortably won their subdivision as well. Now, it was later replaced by the 200 series. Now, the 200 series was also pretty successful as well. Heck, if you go on Facebook and Instagram, you'll probably see posts of them winning their division in the Dakar Rally. They also, at a period of time, still actually race the Toyota Hilux variant. Now, the Hilux is a little bit more successful simply because the class they are under means that they could build the Hilux platform to suit, whereas the 100 series and 200 series category was more restricted simply because they had to stick to a stock body with stock suspension-ish. They can modify that to suit with the equivalent sort of right mods for the class. Now, they are pretty successful, and I'll try and throw up a clip of it racing somewhere.